Walter walks the same path every week, not for groceries, not for routine, but to leave handwritten notes to strangers, reminders that they matter. When the city plans to erase those places, and his memory begins to slip, his daughter learns the truth. He wasn't just walking home. He was holding the neighborhood together. Now, it's their turn. Walter Halls adjusted his weathered brown fedora and stepped out into the crisp Tuesday morning air. At 83, his movements were deliberate but steady, each step a testament to decades of routine. The grocery bag in his left hand contained the usual items: 2 cans of soup, a loaf of bread, milk, and the weekly treat of chocolate chip cookies that reminded him of his wife Ella's baking. His daughter Lisa had offered to drive him again this morning, watching him navigate the front steps. "Dad, it's getting colder," she had said, her voice carrying that particular tone he'd grown accustomed to, part worry, part exhaustion. "I could pick up your groceries on my way home from work." But Walter had declined, as he always did. The walk wasn't just about groceries. It was about something Lisa couldn't understand, something he struggled to explain, even to himself. The first stop on Walter's route was barely 50 yards from Miller's grocery. Mrs. Sotelo's mailbox stood like a faithful sentinel at the end of her driveway. Walter glanced around the quiet street before slipping a small folded piece of paper into the box. The note, written in his careful handwriting, read, "Your garden brings joy to everyone who passes by. The roses are particularly beautiful this year." Mrs. Sotelo was 91 and hadn't been able to tend her garden properly in months, but Walter remembered how proud she'd been of those roses. When Ella was alive, how the two women would chat over the fence about pruning techniques and soil amendments. The garden was overgrown now, but the rose bush still bloomed defiantly against the back fence. Walter continued down the street. The second stop was the Riverside Cafe, where Devin Young was likely preparing for the morning rush. The young man, barely 30, had inherited the struggling business from his uncle 2 years ago. Walter had watched him arrive each day before dawn, determination etched in his posture despite the obvious challenges. Walter approached the small community bulletin board beside the entrance and pinned another note among the advertisements. "Your coffee reminds me of the best mornings. Thank you for keeping this place alive." Inside, Devin was indeed preparing for the day, grinding coffee beans and arranging pastries in the display case. He had no idea that the elderly man who occasionally waved through the window was the source of the encouraging notes that had been appearing sporadically over the past several months. Walter's third stop required a slight detour down the street. The Andersons' house sat on a corner lot, distinguishable by the wheelchair ramp that had been installed last spring after Mr. Anderson's stroke. Walter had known Tom Anderson for 40 years. They'd worked together at the manufacturing plant until Walter's retirement. Now, Tom spent most days in his chair by the front window, watching the world go by with the resigned patience of someone whose world had suddenly shrunk. The note Walter left in their mailbox was longer than usual. "I think about our conversations at the plant break room. You always made everyone laugh, even during the tough times. That gift hasn't left you. I see you wave to the school children every morning." The truth was, Walter had noticed that Tom's waves were becoming less frequent. The stroke had stolen more than just his mobility. It had taken something from his spirit. But Walter remembered the man who could lighten any room with a well-timed joke or a kind word about someone's family. By the time Walter reached the heart of his route, the sky had darkened. The buildings here were older. They had been the town's commercial center back in the 1950s. Most were empty now, but one building held particular significance for Walter: the narrow storefront that had once housed Ella's flowers. Walter stopped in front of the building, his hand resting on the cold brick wall. The faded sign above the door was barely legible, but he could still make out the elegant script that had once announced his wife's business. Ella had run the flower shop for 23 years, building relationships with customers who became friends, arranging flowers for weddings and funerals, bringing beauty to the everyday moments of people's lives. She had been gone for 3 years now, but Walter still visited the building every Tuesday. Today, he placed his note in the mail slot that no longer received mail. "I brought you daisies on our first date. You said they were ordinary flowers, but that ordinary things could be made extraordinary with the right care. You were right about everything. The notes to Ella were different from the others. They were conversations, updates on their daughter, observations about the changing neighborhood, and admissions of loneliness that he couldn't share with anyone else. Sometimes he told her about Lisa's promotion at her work, or about how their grandson had made the high school basketball team. Other times, he simply described the weather or mentioned a song he'd heard on the radio that reminded him of their dancing days. Walter was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost missed the man in the expensive suit standing across the street. The man was taking photographs of the building, making notes on a tablet. Walter's chest tightened with the familiar anxiety. He'd seen similar men in suits visiting other empty buildings in the neighborhood over the past month. "Excuse me," Walter called out, his voice carrying more authority than he'd felt in years. "Can I help you with something?" The man looked up, startled. "Oh, just doing some research on the property," he said, with a practiced smile. "Beautiful old building. Do you know anything about its history?" Walter's jaw tightened. "My wife owned this building for over 20 years. She ran a flower shop here." "Flower shop," the man repeated, making another note. "That's nice. Well, buildings like this have a lot of potential for redevelopment. The whole block, actually." The word redevelopment hit Walter like a physical blow. He had suspected this day would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. What kind of redevelopment? Modern retail space, maybe some apartments above. The city's really encouraging mixed-use development in this area. Bring some life back to the neighborhood. Walter wanted to tell him that the neighborhood already had life, that it was full of stories and memories and connections that couldn't be demolished and rebuilt. Instead, he nodded politely and continued on his way, his steps feeling heavier than before. The remainder of Walter's route took him past the old barber shop where he'd gotten his hair cut for 40 years before Mr. Rotter retired, past the pharmacy that had been replaced by a chain store, past the small park where he and Ella had brought Lisa to play on summer evenings. Each stop held a note, a small act of recognition for the people and places that others seemed to overlook. By the time Walter reached his street, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Lisa's car was in the driveway. She had come home early from work. He could see her silhouette in the kitchen window, probably preparing dinner and worrying about him simultaneously. "Dad, there you are," Lisa said, as he entered through the back door. "I was starting to worry. You were gone longer than usual." Walter set his groceries on the counter and began unpacking them slowly. "Same route, as always. Just took my time." Lisa watched him arrange the items in the refrigerator and pantry, noting the slight tremor in his hands that had become more pronounced over the past few months. "Dad, I've been thinking, maybe it would be easier if I just picked up your groceries when I do my shopping on weekends. You wouldn't have to worry about the weather or carrying the bags." "I don't mind the walk," Walter said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's good for me. But what if something happens? What if you fall, or get lost?" "Or, I won't get lost," Walter interrupted, though even as he said it, he remembered the moment of confusion he'd experienced last week, when he'd momentarily forgotten which street led back to his house. The memory had returned quickly, but the few seconds of disorientation had frightened him more than he cared to admit. Lisa studied her father's face, searching for signs of the man who had once seemed invincible. She saw the stubbornness that had always been part of his character, but also something else, a fragility that broke her heart. "I know you're independent, Dad. I just worry about you out there alone." Walter reached across the kitchen table and patted his daughter's hand. "I know you do, sweetheart, but that walk is important to me. It's not just about the groceries." "Then what is it about?" Walter considered trying to explain about the notes, about the connections he was trying to maintain, about the way the walk made him feel useful and purposeful. But he knew Lisa would see it as further evidence of his declining mental state. Instead, he said, "It's about remembering who I used to be." That night, after Lisa had gone home to her apartment, Walter sat in his living room and thought about the man with the tablet. The idea of losing Ella's building felt like losing her all over again. But what could he do? He was just one old man with a failing memory and a handful of notes that no one knew he was writing. Walter was beginning his Tuesday routine. But this week, something felt different. The tremor in his hands was more pronounced, and he had awakened twice during the night, momentarily unsure of where he was. Lisa had called that morning to check on him, her voice carrying the particular strain that came from trying to manage aging parents while maintaining her own life. As Walter reached Mrs. Sotelo's mailbox, he fumbled slightly with the note. The message was shorter than usual. "Thank you for being a good neighbor all these years." At the Riverside Cafe, Devin was watching through the window when he saw an elderly man in a brown fedora approach the bulletin board. The man moved carefully, glancing around before pinning something among the community announcements. He hurriedly stepped outside. "Excuse me," he called softly. Walter turned, his expression startled and slightly guilty. "Yes, I'm Devin, the owner of this place. I wanted to thank you for the notes." Walter's face flushed slightly. "I don't know what you mean. The encouraging notes. They've meant a lot to me, especially during the tough times. I've been wondering who was writing them." Walter studied the young man's face, seeing genuine gratitude rather than the pity or concern he'd grown accustomed to from Lisa. "The cafe reminds me of places that used to be," he said finally. "Places where people knew each other's names. Would you like to come in for coffee?" "It's on the house." Walter hesitated. His routine didn't include stopping for coffee, but something about Devin's invitation felt important. "I suppose I have a few minutes." Inside the cafe, Devin poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Walter at a small table near the window. "I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Walter." "Walter Halls." "Well, Walter, I have to tell you, your notes have been like a lifeline. Running this place has been harder than I expected. Some days I wonder if I'm just fighting a losing battle." Walter sipped his coffee, which was indeed excellent. "My wife always said that the things worth fighting for are usually the hardest battles." "What did she do?" "She had a flower shop 3 blocks down, that building that's been empty for the past few years." Devin nodded. "I know that one. There's been a lot of talk about redevelopment in that area." Walter's expression darkened. "Yes, I've heard. It would be a shame to tear down those old buildings. They have character." "They have more than character," Walter said quietly. "They have memory." As Walter continued his route that day, he felt a strange sense of urgency. The encounter with Devin had reminded him of something he'd been trying to forget, that his walks might not continue indefinitely. The tremor in his hands, the occasional moments of confusion, the way Lisa watched him with growing concern. All signs that his independence was more fragile than he wanted to admit. At the Andersons' house, Walter paused longer than usual before leaving his note. Through the front window, he could see Tom in his wheelchair, staring out at the street with the vacant expression that had become more common since the stroke. Walter's note today was personal. "I miss our conversations about baseball and politics. You always had the best insights about both. I hope you know that your thoughts still matter." When Walter reached Ella's building, he found the man with the tablet there again, this time accompanied by 2 other people in business attire. They were measuring the front of the building and making notes about the structural features. Walter felt a surge of anger mixed with helplessness. "Back again?" he asked, approaching the group. The man looked up and smiled with practiced politeness. "Mr. Halls, right?" "Yes, we're just doing some preliminary assessments. The property owner is considering his options." "What kind of options?" "Well, the building would need extensive renovation to meet current codes. Sometimes it's more cost-effective to start fresh." Walter felt the words like a physical blow. "Start fresh," he repeated. "The neighborhood could really benefit from modernization. New businesses, updated infrastructure, and better parking. Progress, you know." Walter wanted to argue, to explain that progress wasn't always about tearing down and rebuilding, that sometimes the most important things were the ones that had been there all along. But he knew his words would carry no weight with these people. Instead, he placed his note in the mail slot and continued on his way. That evening, Lisa stopped by for dinner, as she did every Tuesday. She had noticed that her father seemed more tired than usual, and there was something in his expression that worried her. "Dad, are you feeling all right? You seem distant tonight." Walter pushed his food around his plate. I've been thinking about your mother's building. What about it? Developers are looking at it. They want to tear it down. Lisa felt a pang of sadness, but also relief that her father was being realistic about the situation. Dad, that building has been empty for years. Maybe it's time to let someone else use the space. It's not just space, Walter said, his voice rising slightly. It's where your mother built her life. She helped people celebrate and mourn, and mark the important moments. She made the neighborhood beautiful, I know, Dad. But Mom's gone. The building is just a building. It's not just a building to me. Lisa reached across the table and took her father's hand. I understand that it has memories, but holding on to buildings won't bring Mom back. I'm not trying to bring her back, Walter said quietly. I'm trying to keep her from disappearing completely. The next morning, Walter's routine was disrupted by a phone call from Lisa. She was worried about a conversation she'd had with Mrs. Sotelo, who had mentioned seeing Walter walking much farther than his usual route to the grocery store. Dad, Mrs. Sotelo says she saw you over on Riverside Street yesterday. That's not on your way to Miller's grocery. Walter felt caught, though he wasn't sure why he felt guilty about his expanded route. I sometimes take a different path. It's good to vary the routine. But Dad, that's almost 2 miles out of your way. What if you got confused or tired? What if something happened? Nothing happened. I'm fine. But you're not fine, Dad. You're 83 years old. You have episodes where you forget things. Last week, you couldn't remember what day it was. Walter felt the familiar surge of frustration that came with being managed by his own daughter. I remember what's important. I'm not saying you don't. I'm just saying that maybe it's time to be more careful. Maybe it's time to consider some help. The word help carried implications that Walter wasn't ready to face. He knew what Lisa meant: assisted living, supervised activities, someone else making decisions about his daily routine. The end of his walks, the end of his notes, the end of his connection to the neighborhood that had been his life. I don't need help, he said firmly. I need to keep doing what I've always done. But even as he said it, Walter felt the truth of his situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. His body was failing him in small but significant ways. His memory was becoming unreliable. His independence was slipping away one confused moment at a time. That Tuesday, Walter's walk took on a different quality. Each step felt weighted with the knowledge that there might not be many more opportunities for these quiet acts of connection. At Mrs. Sotelo's mailbox, he left a note that was also a goodbye. Your kindness to a lonely old man has meant more than you know. Keep blooming. At the Riverside Cafe, Devin was waiting for him. The young man had been watching for Walter every day since their conversation, hoping to continue building a friendship that felt important to both of them. Walter, I was hoping you'd stop by. I have something to show you. Devin led Walter inside and pulled out a small notebook. I've been keeping track of all the notes you've left. Not just the ones here, but I've been asking around the neighborhood. Mrs. Sotelo showed me the ones you left for her. The Andersons, too. Walter felt exposed, as if a private ritual had been made public. Those weren't meant for anyone else to see, but they should be seen, Devin said earnestly. Do you realize what you've been doing? You've been documenting the heart of this neighborhood. You've been reminding people that they matter. Walter sat down heavily in the chair by the window. I've been trying to remember, mostly. Trying to hold on to things that are disappearing. But you've been giving people hope too. Mrs. Sotelo told me that your notes have been the bright spot in her week. She keeps them in a box by her bed. I don't know how much longer I can keep walking, Walter admitted. My daughter thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. Devin sat across from him. What if we could make sure your notes didn't disappear? What if we could turn them into something permanent? Walter looked at the young man with curiosity. What do you mean? A book. A small book with all your notes. Maybe some stories about the neighborhood. Something that would preserve what you've been doing. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying to Walter. His private ritual will be public. His quiet observations shared with strangers. But perhaps that was what was needed, a way to ensure that the connections he'd been nurturing wouldn't die with him. I don't know if anyone would want to read such a thing, Walter said. I think you'd be surprised. People are hungry for connection, for stories that remind them why community matters. Your notes do that. Walter was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Ella and what she would have said about such a project. She had always been the one to encourage him to share his thoughts, to trust that his words had value. What would we call it? He asked finally. How about The Long Way Home? Because that's what you've been doing, isn't it? Taking the long way home, and finding all the important stops along the way. Walter smiled for the first time in weeks. Ella would have liked that title. 2 weeks later, Walter's routine was interrupted by an event that changed everything. He was walking past the old barber shop when a sharp pain struck his chest. The world tilted sideways, and suddenly he was on the sidewalk, struggling to breathe. Devin, who had just picked up supplies for his calf at the grocery store, saw it happen. He rushed toward Walter and immediately called 911. By the time the ambulance arrived, Walter was conscious but weak. Lisa met her dad at the hospital, her face pale with worry and guilt. "Dad, what were you doing over there? That's not on your usual route." Walter looked at his daughter from the hospital bed, machines beeping softly around him. "I was leaving a note for Mr. Rotter. He's been having a hard time since his wife died." "Dad, Mr. Rotter moved to London 2 years ago. The barber shop has been empty." The confusion in Walter's eyes was evident, and Lisa felt her heart break a little more. The man who had always been her anchor, her source of stability and wisdom, was slipping away piece by piece. "I thought," Walter began, then stopped. "I thought he was still there, Dr. Maindres," who had been treating Walter for several months, pulled Lisa aside. The episode was a minor cardiac event, but combined with the cognitive symptoms, "We need to discuss your father's care needs. He's becoming a danger to himself." Lisa nodded, though the admission felt like a betrayal. "What are you recommending?" "Supervised care. Not necessarily a nursing home, but he shouldn't be living alone. And definitely no more unsupervised walks." When Lisa returned to Walter's room, she found him staring out the window. "Dad, we need to talk about what happens next." Walter turned to face her, and she saw resignation in his eyes. "You want to put me somewhere. I want to keep you safe. Dr. Maindres says you can't live alone anymore. What about my walks?" Lisa felt tears threatening. "Dad, you got confused out there. You could have been seriously hurt. But the notes." "What notes, Dad?" Walter realized that he had never told Lisa about his real purpose for the walks. In his weakened state, the explanation seemed too complicated, too likely to be dismissed as further evidence of his declining mental state. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Nothing important." For several months, Devin had been thinking about their conversation every day since Walter's hospitalization. He had been collecting the notes that Walter had left around the neighborhood, talking to recipients, gathering the stories that connected them all. When he learned that Walter was being moved to an assisted living facility, he knew he had to act quickly. Devin arranged to visit Walter at Golden Years Assisted Living, a clean but institutional building on the outskirts of town. He found Walter in the common room, staring at a television that was showing a game show no one was watching. "I brought you something," Devin said, sitting beside Walter and pulling out a small bound book. Walter took the book with shaking hands. The cover was simple but elegant, with the title, "The Long Way Home," in script that reminded him of Ella's handwriting. Below it, in smaller type, "Notes from the Neighborhood by Walter Halls." "You actually did it," Walter whispered. "I had help." Mrs. Sotelo typed up all the notes. The Andersons helped with editing. Even some people I didn't know came forward when word got around about what you'd been doing. Walter opened the book and saw his own words, but formatted and presented in a way that made them look important, permanent. The first section was titled "Letters to Ella" and contained the notes he had been leaving at the flower shop. The second section was "Neighborhood Connections" and included all the encouraging messages he had left for others. "People are buying copies," Devin continued. "The profits are going to a fund we set up. We're going to try to save your wife's building." Walter looked up from the book, his eyes bright with tears. "Save it? Turn it into a community center, a place where people can gather, maybe have a small cafe, definitely a space for flowers. We want to call it Ella's Way. How many people know about the book? Half the town, at least. People are talking about your notes, about the connections you were making. Some of them are starting their own note-writing projects. Walter smiled, the first genuine smile he had. Ella would have loved that. There's something else, Devin said. We want you to be part of the community center, not just as an inspiration, but as a regular presence. Someone who can tell the stories, help people understand what connection means. Walter felt a surge of purpose that he hadn't experienced since his hospitalization. But I'm not supposed to walk alone anymore. Then we'll walk with you. Different people, different days. Think of it as expanding your route to include the whole community. 6 months later, Ella's Way opened its doors for the first time. The building had been restored with careful attention to its original character while meeting modern safety codes. The front room housed a small cafe where Devin served coffee and pastries. The back room had been converted into a community meeting space with comfortable chairs and tables for letter writing. Walter was there every day, sometimes accompanied by Lisa, sometimes by new friends from the neighborhood. He had a small table by the window where he wrote notes for people to take and share. The tremor in his hands had worsened, but his words remained clear and meaningful. On the wall near his table was a framed copy of the first note he had ever written, the one he had left at Mrs. Sotelo's mailbox. Your garden brings joy to everyone who passes by. Below it was a small plaque, in memory of Ella Halls, who taught us that ordinary things can be made extraordinary with the right care. Lisa visited every afternoon after work, marveling at the transformation in her father. He was still forgetting things, still struggling with the effects of aging, but he had found a new purpose. People came to him for advice, for stories, for the kind of human connection that had become rare in their busy world. Dad, do you remember why you started writing those notes? Lisa asked one evening as they sat together in the community room. Walter thought for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I wanted to remember, he said finally. I wanted to make sure that the important things didn't disappear. Well, they didn't disappear. If anything, they multiplied. Walter smiled and patted his daughter's hand. Your mother always said that love grows when you share it. I guess she was right about that too. As evening fell over the neighborhood, Walter looked out the window at the street where he had once walked alone. Now, he could see people stopping to read the community bulletin board, neighbors chatting over coffee, and children playing in the small garden that had been planted where the old parking lot used to be. He had taken the long way home, but he had brought the whole neighborhood with him. And in the end, that made all the difference. The book, The Long Way Home, continued to sell, with proceeds supporting other community initiatives. Walter's notes had become a movement, inspiring people to reach out to neighbors, to notice the overlooked, to remember that every person and place had a story worth preserving. And every Tuesday, Walter still took his walk not alone anymore, but accompanied by friends who had learned that sometimes the most important destinations are the ones you discover along the way.